Imagine you are just falling through water.
Just completely free-falling.
Right. You start at the sunlit surface, and you just begin to sink. And for an hour, maybe 2 hours, 3 hours, you are just dropping.
It's like passing the height of Mount Everest, but, in reverse.
Exactly. You're plunging into this habitat that is so unfathomably vast. It is literally larger than every rainforest, every desert, and every mountain range on this planet combined.
It's massive.
It is. And as you fall, you enter a place where the sun has not touched the ground for 4.5 billion years. So welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We have custom tailored this exploration specifically for you today. We're taking a stack of source material centered around this profoundly haunting text titled, "There is a place on this planet where the sun has," well, it cuts off there, but you get the idea.
It sets the tone perfectly.
It really does. Our mission today is to take you into the aphotic zone, the midnight zone.
The real deep dark.
Yeah, and we aren't just here to, catalog the weird and wonderful creatures of the abyss. We are going to explore a world where the absolute most dangerous thing an animal can do is keep its eyes open.
Which is wild because it fundamentally rewrites our entire understanding of biology.
Right.
I mean, when you remove sunlight from an ecosystem completely, you aren't just removing a light source. You are removing essentially the foundational currency of life.
The money, basically.
Exactly. This isn't just some biological curiosity about weird fish in the dark. It is a brutal masterclass lesson in physiological economics.
Yeah, it's a story about wasted energy, right? About how evolution actively sabotages anatomy just to save calories.
Yes, and about how life perceives a world that is completely devoid of the one thing we always assume life needs most: light.
Okay, so that concept of a biological economy, that is the through line we are going to follow today. Because the text sets up this brilliant premise to understand why an animal would literally erase its own visual system from its DNA. We have to trace this descent slowly.
We have to go down step by step.
Right, because we have to look at the physics of the water column. The ocean is not just this monolith.
Yeah.
Every 100 meters you drop, the physics change, the light changes, and the biological tax brackets completely upend themselves.
Precisely. So if we start at the surface, in the epipelagic zone, which marine biologists just call the sunlight zone, down to about 200 meters, the rules there are highly familiar to us.
Because there's light.
Right. Vision here is an absolute necessity. It is probably the single most valuable sense an organism can possess.
Because, as the source text points out, eyes are incredibly cheap to use up here. Because, well, there's something to see.
Exactly. You can spot a predator from 100 feet away.
Or you can track a mate, you can find food. The evolutionary return on investment for building a high-resolution optical system up there is astronomical. It pays for itself every single day.
But as you begin to descend, the water itself becomes this active antagonist to vision.
It fights back.
It really does. Water is a profoundly effective filter. It doesn't just block light evenly, turning the world gray. It steals light selectively, wavelength by wavelength, in this incredibly rigid sequence. And it's all based on the physical energy of the photons themselves.
The text describes water stealing light the way sand steals footprints.
Yeah.
Which it's poetry. It gets surgically dismantled. And I want to pause on the physics of this theft because it really forces us to rethink what color actually is.
It does.
When sunlight hits the ocean's surface, it's carrying the full visible spectrum. But water molecules have these specific vibrational frequencies, and they just aggressively absorb the longer wavelengths of light first.
That's the critical mechanism right there. So red light has the longest wavelength and the lowest energy in the visible spectrum.
Okay.
Because of that low energy, it simply lacks the penetrating power to push through the density of those H2O molecules. Within the very first few meters of descent, the red photons are entirely absorbed.
Wow.
The kinetic energy of those photons is literally converted into microscopic amounts of heat in the water. So the color red is it's gone.
It just doesn't exist anymore. Let's ground this in that visceral example from the text because it really drives home how alien this environment becomes just like a few dozen meters down.
Oh, the diver example.
Yeah. Imagine you're a diver. You were swimming at about 60 meters deep, so roughly the height of a 20-story building.
Pretty deep, but not crazy.
Right. And you scrape your hand against a piece of wreckage or some jagged coral, and you start bleeding. You hold your hand up to your mask. You fully expect to see this bright crimson blood billowing out into the water. But you don't.
Because the color red does not exist at 60 meters.
It's just deleted.
Literally, there are 0 red photons making it down to that depth to bounce off your hemoglobin and reflect back into your retina.
So your brain, which is, desperately trying to interpret this visual data without the required wavelengths, it just processes the blood as this deep, terrifying black.
Or sometimes a dark, muddy green.
Yeah. The ocean has literally reached out and deleted the color red from your reality before the light could even reach your eye. It makes me think of the ocean as this aggressive, planetary-scale audio filter.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Like, imagine you are listening to this complex symphony, and a sound engineer slowly starts rolling off the high frequencies on the equalizer.
Right, so the treble completely drops away. You lose the flutes, then you lose the violins.
Exactly. First, the cymbals and hi-hats disappear, and that's the red light. Then the snare drums get muffled, which is the orange and yellow light fading out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Eventually, the vocals in the mid-range just drop out as the green light gets absorbed. Until finally, you are left with nothing but this incredibly low, heavy, thumping bass line that just vibrates in your chest. And in the ocean, that bass line is blue light.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it, because blue light possesses a much shorter wavelength and a higher energy.
So it punches through.
Exactly. It threads the needle through the water molecules, penetrating deeper into the column than any other color. It is literally the absolute last color standing.
Which leads to that haunting line from the source text. It says that when there is any light left in the deep ocean at all, it is the color of a bruised fading blue.
It's a great description. And that bruised blue environment, that is where the evolutionary pressure cooker truly begins.
Right.
By the time you pass 200 meters, you have lost over 99% of the surface sunlight.
Yeah.
You are entering the mesopelagic zone, the twilight zone.
Though the text is pretty quick to point out that calling it twilight is incredibly generous.
Very generous.
It's not this soft, romantic evening glow. It is the suffocating, dying breath of the day that is about to permanently end. But here is the major pivot point in the source material, and it completely subverted my expectations.
How so?
Well, you would naturally assume that the most extreme, bizarre evolutionary adaptations would happen at the very bottom of the ocean, right? In the pitch black.
Sure, that's the intuition.
But the text argues the exact opposite. The most intense, desperate evolutionary war for vision doesn't happen in the total dark. It happens right here, in the half-light of the twilight zone.
Because this is where the resource is the most scarce, but still biologically usable. To understand the sheer ferocity of this environment, we really have to look at the biomass density.
Oh, yeah, the numbers here are wild.
They really are. While scientists are still modeling the exact numbers, current estimates suggest that the twilight zone might contain more biomass than the entire rest of the ocean combined.
That is insane.
You're talking about billions of tons of lanternfish, bristlemouths, crustaceans, cephalopods. It is arguably the largest concentration of animal life on the entire planet.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because the math there is just staggering. You have the highest concentration of animal life on Earth crammed into a space where the primary resource for survival light and, the spatial information it provides is essentially vanishing. So how does that sheer density of life impact the competition for whatever tiny fraction of a photon is actually left drifting down from above?
It creates an environment of hyper-competition that drives natural selection into absolute overdrive.
It's an arms race.
Exactly. Think of it as a biological arms race where the stakes are immediate and absolute. Every single stray photon of light is a highly prized commodity.
Because it's life or death.
Completely.
Yeah.
If your visual system is sensitive enough to detect the faintest silhouette of a smaller fish against that bruised blue background above you, you get to eat today.
Right.
And if your visual system isn't sensitive enough to detect the shadow of the predator swimming directly above you, you are eaten. It is a strictly binary outcome.
So you don't lose your eyes in the twilight zone. You double down. You pour every single ounce of your metabolic budget into building a better photon trap.
Precisely. If there is almost no ambient light, the physical constraints of optics give you exactly one option. You have to increase the aperture of your biological camera.
You just need a bigger lens.
You must evolve a larger lens, a wider pupil, and vastly more retinal surface area just to maximize the probability of catching a single particle of light.
And this evolutionary imperative to just increase the aperture gives us some of the most surreal science fiction anatomy on the planet. The text focuses on a few incredible examples, starting with the barrel eye fish.
Oh, the barrel eye, a true marvel of biological engineering.
It is so weird.
When you look at the barrel eye, the first thing you notice is that the entire top of its head is this transparent, fluid-filled dome that looks like a cockpit made of glass.
Literally a glass cockpit. And inside that transparent dome, nestled deep in the skull, it has these two enormous glowing green barrel-shaped eyes.
Tubular eyes.
Yeah. And they don't look forward like a normal fish. They rotate, but they predominantly point straight up, scanning through the transparent roof of their own head, watching that bruised blue downwelling light for the silhouettes of prey swimming overhead. I mean, it honestly looks like a submersible designed by an engineer who was deeply intoxicated.
It does look bizarre, but the mechanics of it are flawlessly optimized for the Twilight Zone.
Really?
Yes. By utilizing tubular eyes, the barrel eye effectively acts like a pair of high-powered binoculars. Tubular eyes have a massive lens relative to the size of the retina, which captures a huge amount of light, but it drastically narrows the field of view.
So it's got tunnel vision.
Exactly. And to compensate for having essentially tunnel vision, the eyes can rotate within that fluid dome.
Okay, let's look at the logic of that dome, though, because I genuinely struggle with this while reading. We just established that the Twilight Zone is a hyper-competitive war zone where literally everything is trying to eat you.
It is.
So if you were swimming around in a predator-rich environment, why on earth would evolution select for a skull made of a delicate, transparent membrane? Isn't that a massive structural vulnerability?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
It feels like walking onto a battlefield wearing a glass helmet just so you can have a slightly better view of the sky.
That is exactly the kind of cost-benefit analysis evolution is constantly running, and it really highlights just how skewed the physics of the deep sea are.
Okay, explain.
You are applying the logic of a terrestrial environment, or the sunlight zone, where physical impact and structural integrity are paramount. If you get hit, you need armor.
Right.
But in the Twilight Zone, the greatest threat to your survival isn't blunt force trauma from another animal. The greatest threat is simply not seeing the predator before its jaws are already closing around you.
Ah, so the structural weakness of the transparent head is completely irrelevant if you never get hit in the first place.
Precisely. The survival math dictates that it is infinitely better to have a fragile, transparent shield that allows your massive upward-pointing eyes to see an attack coming than it is to have a thick, protective, bony skull that leaves you completely blind to the threat above.
Wow. Okay, that makes sense.
Furthermore, the transparent dome serves a highly specific secondary purpose. The barrel eye frequently hunts by stealing prey from the tentacles of massive, stinging siphonophores.
Those are like those colonial jellyfish things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the fluid-filled dome physically protects those delicate, highly invested tubular eyes from the stinging cells of the siphonophore while it steals their food.
No way. So it's literally a blast shield for stealing food in the dark.
Exactly.
That completely changes the framing. The physical vulnerability is actually a highly specialized defensive adaptation for a very specific ecological niche.
It really is. And if we move from the barrel-eye fish to the cephalopods, the text provides another example that perfectly illustrates this ruthless biological autonomy.
The cockeyed squid.
Yes, the cockeyed squid.
Often called the strawberry squid because it's covered in these little photophores that look like seeds. But the eyes are what make it look like a glitch in the biological matrix.
It's incredibly asymmetrical.
Yeah, the text describes this animal as having totally asymmetric vision. It has one massive, bulging, yellow-lensed eye on the left side of its body that points upwards. And on the right side, it has a completely normal, much smaller blue eye that points downwards.
Two completely different optical systems on the exact same face.
It's crazy.
But it is arguably the most brilliant example of metabolic resource allocation we have on record.
Okay, break that down.
We know that building and maintaining a giant eye is incredibly expensive from a caloric standpoint. The squid needs a massive eye to look up for the exact same reason the barrel eye does, to detect the faint, dark silhouettes of prey blocking out the last residual blue light from the surface.
Right, and the text notes that the giant upward-looking eye has a yellow lens. Why yellow? Why not just clear?
That yellow lens acts as a highly specific optical filter.
Oh, really?
Yes. Many predators and prey in the Twilight Zone use a trick called counterillumination. They have these light-producing organs on their bellies that emit a faint blue glow, which perfectly matches the bruised, bleed, downwelling light from the surface.
So they're blending in with the light.
Exactly. To anything looking up from below, their silhouette is effectively erased. They blend in perfectly with the sky. Very. But the yellow lens on the cockeyed squid's giant eye filters out specific wavelengths of that bioluminescence, essentially breaking the camouflage and revealing the animal hiding in the light.
That is an unbelievable countermeasure.
Yeah.
So the giant eye is this highly specialized camouflage-breaking satellite dish pointed at the surface.
That's a good way to put it.
But then we have the small eye pointing down. Why not just have two giant eyes and see absolutely everything?
Because looking down into the abyss, there is absolutely zero residual sunlight. There is no background glow against which a silhouette could possibly be cast.
Oh, right, because it's just black below them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you are looking down, the only light you are ever going to see is a sudden, sharp, brilliant flash of bioluminescence from another animal. Perhaps a predator lunging or prey trying to startle you.
And you don't need a massive, metabolically expensive, ultra-sensitive satellite dish just to see a bright strobe light going off in a pitch-black room.
No, you don't.
A cheap, standard-issue motion sensor will do the job perfectly.
Precisely. The cockeyed squid has run the metabolic calculus. Growing a second massive eye to look into the darkness would be a catastrophic waste of calories.
Right.
The return on investment for downward-looking vision caps out very early, so it splits its visual resources. It invests heavily in the upward-facing camera where sensitivity really matters, and it cuts costs entirely on the downward-facing camera where it doesn't.
It is the literal embodiment of an arms race. But the arms race isn't just happening at the macro level with the size of the eyes, right?
Yeah.
The source points out that a massive cellular shift is happening deep inside the retinas of these animals.
Oh, yes, the shift in photoreceptor architecture.
Right. And we know the basics, like we have rods and cones. Cones require a ton of light and give us our color vision and sharp details. Rods are terrible at color and detail, but they are incredibly sensitive to dim light.
Basic biology, sure.
Yeah. And the text notes that these deep-sea fish essentially abandon their cones entirely.
But the adaptation is much more sophisticated than just swapping one cell type for another. Well, anyone familiar with biology knows that rods dominate night vision. What is truly remarkable in the twilight zone is how these rod cells are deployed.
Okay.
In a human eye, we have a single layer of photoreceptors, but many deep-sea fishes have evolved what are called multi-bank retinas.
Multi-bank retinas, like stacking the sensors.
Exactly. They literally stack multiple layers of rod cells on top of each other, sometimes up to 6 or more layers deep.
Wow.
Furthermore, the outer segments of these rod cells, the parts that actually contain the light-sensitive opsin proteins, are incredibly elongated.
So they are basically building a thicker, denser net to catch the photons. Like if a photon manages to slip past the first layer of rod cells without hitting a receptor, it has a chance to be caught by the second layer or the third or the fourth.
Yes, it maximizes the probability of absorption to an absolute physical limit. These retinas are so tightly packed with rhodopsin, which is the biological pigment that reacts to light, that the eyes of these fish often appear a deep reflective gold or just perfectly black.
It absorbs everything.
Right. They are essentially trading the ability to see a high-definition, full-color moving image for the ability to process a highly sensitive, grainy, monochromatic security camera feed. They sacrifice all nuance just to detect the presence or absence of a shadow.
But just as I thought I understood the rules of this bruised blue, rod-dominated twilight zone, the text introduces a massive biological contradiction, a lingering mystery that completely upends what we established earlier about the color red.
The private bandwidth of red bioluminescence is fascinating.
Yes, we established unequivocally that red light is absorbed by the ocean within the first few dozen meters. It physically does not exist down here.
Sure.
The background color of the twilight zone is blue. Almost all bioluminescence down here is blue or green because those are the wavelengths that travel furthest in water.
Right.
And yet, researchers studying these highly stacked ultrasensitive rod cells found something impossible. They found visual pigments in certain deep-sea fish that are perfectly tuned to detect red light.
It is one of the most brilliant evolutionary workarounds in all of biology. You have to consider the logic here.
Walk me through it.
If the entire ecosystem has evolved over millions of years in an environment devoid of red light, then the vast majority of animals have completely lost the biological hardware required to even see red.
Right.
To them, red is not a color. It is an absence. It is literally invisible.
It's outside their perceivable spectrum, like how ultraviolet or infrared is to us. We just can't see it.
Exactly. So what happens if an animal manages to re-evolve the ability to produce red light and simultaneously re-evolves the specific retinal pigments required to see it?
They get a private, encrypted channel of light.
Yes.
The text uses the example of the stoplight loosejaw fish. It has this specialized photophore right under its eye that acts like a biological flashlight. But instead of emitting standard blue light, it emits a deep red beam.
And because it possesses the unique visual pigments to see that specific wavelength, it can essentially project a red sniper beam into the darkness.
While its prey is completely oblivious, the prey is just sitting there, bathed in this red light, but because it doesn't have the retinal architecture to perceive those long wavelengths, it thinks it's still hiding in pitch darkness.
It's a massive advantage.
It has no idea it's being illuminated and targeted until the loosejaw's teeth are already sinking in.
It is the biological equivalent of possessing military-grade night vision goggles with an infrared laser sight, while everyone else on the battlefield is completely blind to infrared.
That is so unfair.
It is. Evolution extended an immense amount of metabolic energy to synthesize entirely unique visual pigments just to create a stealth hunting mechanism that exploits the sensory blind spots of the entire ecosystem.
It just shows you how far this arms race goes, the staggering biochemical lengths these animals will go to, the sheer amount of cellular engineering they will undertake just to gain a slight localized visual edge in the fading light.
It does. But here is where the narrative shifts dramatically. Because this desperate, hyper-complex arms race to build bigger, better, stealthier eyes, it hits a hard, immovable physical boundary.
Yeah.
And the arms race doesn't end because the loose jawfish or the cockeyed squid wins. It ends because the battlefield itself fundamentally changes.
Right, because as we continue our descent past 1,000 meters, we officially cross the threshold into the midnight zone. And the text makes this transition incredibly stark. We are no longer talking about dim light. We are no longer talking about the bruised blue of the twilight zone.
No.
At 1,000 meters, sunlight is zero. Not a single photon from the sun will ever, under any circumstances, reach this depth.
And this is where the biological logic we've been following completely inverts. If you extrapolate the rules of the twilight zone, where less light means you need a bigger eye to survive, you would naturally assume that the midnight zone, possessing no light, would be filled with creatures sporting eyes the size of beach balls.
Right. A final, desperate, maximalist push to catch whatever scattered bioluminescence exists.
Exactly. If the cockeyed squid needs a giant eye for dim light, an animal in no light should theoretically need an eye the size of a satellite dish.
But the exact opposite happens. And this is where the deep dive really fulfills its core mission. Because at 1,000 meters down, animals don't grow bigger eyes. They actively, aggressively start losing them.
And the mechanism behind this loss is the most profound revelation in the source material. If we connect this to the bigger picture, why do animals erase their own eyes?
Yeah. Why?
It isn't because the sheer darkness somehow damages the tissue. It isn't merely a passive process of use it or lose it.
No. It is a brutal calculation of metabolic cost.
It is the ledger of life. The text states it plainly. An eye is one of the most metabolically expensive organs an animal can carry. We rarely consider this because our vision feels so effortless to us.
Right, we just open our eyes.
We open our eyes, light hits the retina, and we see. We don't feel the caloric burn of that process.
Okay, let's unpack this because the cellular maintenance fees are exorbitant. Let's actually look at the math on that because the biology here is fascinating.
Let's do it.
You don't just have the physical structure of the eye, the cornea, the fluid dynamics of the aqueous humor, the constantly renewing cells of the retina. All of that incredibly complex, highly organized tissue requires a continuous, massive supply of oxygen, ATP, and nutrients just to prevent it from degrading.
Even when your eyes are closed.
Right. Just baseline maintenance.
That is just the baseline.
Right.
Then you must factor in the transmission infrastructure. The optic nerve is a massive, densely packed bundle of millions of neurons. And neurons do not rest cheaply.
They need a lot of power.
They do. Maintaining the electrical resting potential across a neural membrane requires the sodium-potassium pumps to run constantly, which consumes massive amounts of cellular energy.
And then we have the final, most expensive piece of the puzzle, right? The brain.
the visual cortex, the sheer computational horsepower required to take millions of raw, chaotic electrical impulses firing from the retina, decode them, and render them into a coherent, three-dimensional, moving, predictive model of the world in real time.
It's basically a supercomputer.
It is. For some species, operating the visual system and its associated neural processing centers can consume up to 15% or more of their total resting metabolic budget.
15%.
Yeah.
Just to keep the cameras powered and the servers running.
It is an astronomical tax. Now, in the sunlight zone or even the twilight zone, paying that 15% tax is the best investment you can make. The spatial information you gain pays for itself in successfully captured prey and avoided predators.
It keeps you alive.
But when you cross into the midnight zone...
When you cross into the midnight zone, the sun is mathematically eliminated from the equation. There are no shadows, there are no silhouettes, there is only the vast, freezing, crushing black.
So consider the evolutionary mathematics. You are an organism living in an environment where food is incredibly scarce. A single meal, perhaps a piece of a rotting whale carcass drifting down from above, might have to sustain your biology for months.
Wow, months.
Yes, and yet your body is automatically siphoning off 15% of those precious hard-earned calories to power a sensory array that is outputting absolutely zero useful data.
It's like leaving the AC running with the windows open.
It is the definition of biological bankruptcy.
The text uses a phrase that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. Evolution does not preserve organs out of habit. It preserves what pays for itself. That is such a ruthlessly corporate way to look at biology, but it is undeniably true.
It is the ultimate free market economy. If an organ is not actively generating a survival dividend that exceeds its operating cost, it immediately becomes a liability.
Right.
In an environment defined by extreme caloric scarcity, a useless eye isn't just a neutral, benign feature. It is an active threat to your survival. It is bleeding energy away from your immune system, away from your reproductive organs, away from the muscle mass you need to swim to the next meal.
So blindness in the deep ocean isn't an injury. It isn't a tragic consequence of the dark. It is an aggressive, deliberate, highly advantageous evolutionary strategy. You are liquidating a toxic asset.
This fundamentally challenges how we often conceptualize evolution.
How so?
Well, people tend to think of vestigial organs, like the human appendix or the remnants of pelvic bones in modern whales, as things that just slowly, passively atrophy over vast stretches of time.
Right.
The common misconception is that if you don't use it, it just sort of fades away, like a muscle shrinking from lack of exercise.
Right, the whole Lamarckian idea that if a fish lives in a dark cave, its eyes just sort of get lazy and stop working.
But the reality of natural selection is far more active and punitive than that. It is an auditor.
An auditor.
Yes. Let's say you have a population of fish newly isolated in the midnight zone. One individual is born with a random genetic mutation that causes its eyes to be 10% smaller and its optic nerve to be slightly thinner.
Okay.
In the sunlight zone, that fish would be at a severe disadvantage and would likely be eaten. But in the midnight zone, that fish suddenly possesses a massive metabolic advantage over its siblings.
Because it is spending 10% less energy on a useless organ.
Yeah.
It has more calories available to survive a famine or to produce more viable eggs.
Precisely. Generation after generation, the selective pressure heavily favors the individuals who invest the absolute minimum in their visual infrastructure. The individuals stubbornly wasting 15% of their energy on large eyes simply starve to death during the lean times.
Wow.
They are quietly and invisibly outcompeted. The visual cortex shrivels, the optic nerve degrades, and within a surprisingly short evolutionary window, you are left with an entirely new eyeless species.
Okay, I followed the logic perfectly. The metabolic accounting totally makes sense. But I'm going to push back here, because the source material presents a variable that seems to contradict this absolute liquidation.
All right, what is it?
The text notes that roughly 90% of the open water animals below 1,000 meters use bioluminescence. They make their own light.
They do.
So the midnight zone isn't perfectly homogeneously black. There are flashes, there are glowing lures. So isn't there still something to see? If bioluminescence is everywhere, why delete the eye entirely? Why not just keep a highly downgraded, low-resolution, cheap version of an eye just to spot the occasional glowing trap?
That is a phenomenal question, and wrestling with that contradiction is how we truly grasp the extremity of the deep sea. You are correct that bioluminescence exists.
Yeah.
But the evolutionary equation isn't just about whether light exists, it's about the frequency and utility of that light weighed against the constant overhead cost of the detector.
The maintenance fees run 24/7, even if the light only flashes once a week.
Exactly. Imagine you live in a remote, off-the-grid cabin and energy is incredibly limited.
Yeah.
You have a massive, power-hungry satellite internet dish. You keep it powered on 24 hours a day, burning precious generator fuel, solely on the off chance that you might receive a single 1-second email alert once a month.
That would be a terrible idea.
The sheer cost of running the system continuously vastly outweighs the informational value of that rare email. It is biologically cheaper to unplug the system entirely, bulldoze the satellite dish, and rely on a low-energy radio instead.
That analogy clicks perfectly. The brutal economics of the abyss dictate that if the information density of the environment drops below the operating cost of the sensor, the body just ruthlessly liquidates the sensor.
And to see exactly how ruthless this liquidation process is at a cellular level, we need to look at the receipts. We need to examine specific animals in the source material that prove this rule.
Which brings us to the creatures that actually live out this biological economics. The ones that gave up their eyes and the fascinating exceptions that doubled down. Let's start with the liquidation. The text highlights the blind cusk eel.
Found in some of the absolute deepest, most punishing trenches on Earth.
The description in the text is haunting. It says the cusk eel has skin stretched completely smooth over the space where its eye socket should be.
Just skin.
Yeah, it doesn't just have tiny, non-functioning eyes. It is completely paved over the visual system. It hunts entirely by detecting the chemical trails of carrion and the faint vibrations in water pressure that would instantly crush a human being. It is an organism perfectly mathematically optimized for the void.
The cusk eel represents the end-stage result of millions of years of metabolic cost-cutting. The liquidation is complete, but the source material points to another animal, one that isn't even marine, to show us the actual real-time cellular mechanics of how this liquidation occurs.
Oh, the Mexican blind cavefish. This segment of the text absolutely blew my mind.
It is incredible. It provides researchers with a living, real-time window into the genetic mechanics of eye loss.
Because within this single species of freshwater fish, you have distinct populations, right? You have the ancestral populations that live in surface rivers in Mexico, and they have perfectly normal functioning eyes.
Right.
But then, hundreds of thousands of years ago, some of these fish were swept into deep, permanently dark limestone cave systems and became trapped. And those trapped populations, well, they have no eyes at all. But it's how they lose them that is so violent.
It relies on a process known as apoptosis, programmed cell death.
The text describes the embryology, and it says that watching the embryos of these cavefish develop is like watching evolutionary history happen in fast forward. When a blind cavefish embryo begins to grow, it actually starts to form an eye.
Yes, the genetic instructions for building a visual system are still fundamentally there. The tissues start organizing, the cells begin differentiating to build the lens and the retina.
But then, partway through the developmental process, the organism's own genome actively intervenes. Through complex signaling pathways, the body abruptly shuts the construction process down.
It doesn't just stop building, it actually dismantles what it already built.
It tears it down.
Yes.
Yeah.
The body sends in macrophages to chemically break down the developing lens and reabsorb the retinal tissue back into the fish's body.
It is an incredibly precise cellular-level demolition. The organism is not failing to build an eye due to a passive genetic defect. It is being explicitly chemically ordered, cell by individual cell, to halt construction, tear down the scaffolding, and salvage the raw materials.
It's remarkable. You're trying to come up with a way to visualize this, and it's like, imagine a construction crew hired to build this massive, sprawling, multi-million-dollar luxury mansion.
They dig the foundation, they pour the concrete, they put up the intricate wooden framing for this huge estate. And suddenly, halfway through the build, the site foreman gets a call from the bank. The financing has completely fallen through. They realize they are operating in an economy where they cannot possibly afford the monthly mortgage on this mansion.
So what is the most economically viable action? You don't just leave the half-built wooden framing exposed to the elements to slowly rot over the next 20 years.
No, You actively bulldoze it. You rip the lumber back down, you pull the copper wiring out of the walls and sell it for scrap, you fill in the giant foundation, and you use those salvaged materials to build a tiny, hyper-efficient, incredibly cheap concrete bunker instead.
That is exactly what happens.
The cavefish embryo is bulldozing its own luxury optical system to save those valuable cellular building materials, the proteins, the lipids, the metabolic energy, for something that will actually keep it alive in the dark.
That is precisely the biological reality. The energy and structural proteins that would have been wasted on finishing that useless eye are reallocated. They are routed into developing vastly larger and more sensitive olfactory organs or expanding the mechanosensory systems along the jawline.
The body literally cannibalizes its own developing visual system for spare parts.
It is equal parts horrifying and mathematically beautiful. It is evolution as a ruthless accountant.
Wow.
But the text doesn't just show us the animals that give up their eyes to balance the ledger. It deeply contrasts them with the animals that do the exact opposite, the exceptions that prove the rule.
Right.
Because if vision in the dark is a currency, you abandon it if it doesn't pay out, but you spend it lavishly if it is the only thing keeping you alive.
Which brings us to the cephalopods of the deep, starting with the vampire squid.
Vampire squid, an animal so morphologically distinct and ancient that it occupies its own entirely separate taxonomic order.
The text notes that it lives hundreds of meters down in a very specific, hostile layer of the ocean called the oxygen minimum zone. It doesn't hunt aggressively like a great white shark. It essentially just drifts in the water column, deploying these long, sticky, retractable filaments to catch marine snow, which is just the detritus and decaying organic matter raining down from the surface.
It lives a life of extreme energy conservation. And yet, if you look at its anatomy, the vampire squid possesses eyes that, proportionally relative to its body size, are among the largest of any animal on the planet.
They are huge.
They are massive, globular, and highly developed.
Which begs the question, why? If we just establish that eyes are a massive metabolic drain, and this animal lives in an oxygen-starved environment, just passively eating garbage plankton, why on earth would it invest such an exorbitant amount of energy into massive eyes?
Because for the vampire squid, the environmental variables alter the metabolic math. In the oxygen minimum zone, there is barely enough dissolved oxygen to sustain basic life functions, let alone power fast, evasive muscle movements. The vampire squid physically cannot swim quickly to escape a predator. It lacks the aerobic capacity to sprint.
So it can't run away.
Exactly. Its only defense mechanisms are physiological tricks like contorting its body to expose intimidating spines or releasing a cloud of glowing bioluminescent mucus to confuse an attacker.
Right.
But to deploy those defenses, it needs time. And in the deep ocean, time is dictated by distance. Those massive, metabolically expensive eyes aren't used for hunting. They are a highly specialized, ultra-sensitive early warning system.
An early warning system?
Yes. They are tuned to detect the absolute faintest, most distant suggestions of bioluminescent light from an approaching predator.
It pays the exorbitant premium for the security system because, without the security system, its lack of speed makes it an automatic target. The massive eye is the only thing standing between it and being eaten.
It is a calculated expenditure. And if we look at the absolute extreme end of the spectrum, the source text introduces an animal that takes this concept of the early warning eye to a terrifying, monumental scale.
The giant squid.
The giant squid, the largest invertebrate on Earth.
The text highlights a physical detail that is almost hard to comprehend. The giant squid possesses eyes the size of dinner plates, up to 10 or 11 inches across.
Enormous.
They are literally the largest eyes of any known animal in the history of the planet. And for decades, marine biologists were completely baffled by this. Why would an animal that spends much of its life hunting in total darkness need an optical lens the size of a frisbee?
It seems on the surface to be a massive contradiction to the rule we just established, a colossal metabolic waste in an environment of scarcity.
Until you look at the specific ecological nightmare that the giant squid has to deal with. Until you look at what eats it.
The sperm whale.
Yeah. The text outlines this predator-prey dynamic and calls it almost unbearably dramatic. The leading hypothesis for why these dinner plate eyes exist is tied entirely to one specific terrifying event.
When the whale dives.
Exactly. When a massive 60-foot sperm whale dives down into the midnight zone to hunt, it displaces a massive amount of water. And as it moves through the pitch-black abyss, its enormous body collides with millions of tiny bioluminescent dinoflagellates and plankton suspended in the water column.
And the physical disturbance causes those microscopic organisms to flash, creating a faint, ghostly, bioluminescent halo that outlines the massive shape of the diving whale.
It's like a glowing outline of a monster.
It really is. And the giant squid's massive dinner plate eye is mathematically optimized through the sheer physics of light collection and spatial resolution to detect that specific, massive glowing shape from the maximum possible distance.
Which is what, up to 120 meters away?
Yes, up to 120 meters away in pitch darkness. The squid isn't using that eye to look for small, intricate details. It isn't looking for food. It is dedicating a massive portion of its metabolic budget solely to scanning the void for the bioluminescent wake of the monster in the dark.
It gives the squid maybe a few extra seconds of advanced warning, a brief, critical window to dive deeper or attempt to evade a fight that, honestly, it usually loses anyway.
Usually, yes.
But those few seconds of warning are the difference between life and death, which makes them entirely worth the immense caloric cost of maintaining a dinner plate eye.
It perfectly encapsulates the brutal economy of the abyss. For the blind cusk eel, an eye is a toxic asset that must be liquidated. For the giant squid, an eye is the only insurance policy against a leviathan.
Right.
Evolution isn't applying a universal rule. It is calculating a highly specific cost-benefit analysis for every single species independently, based on their unique ecological pressures.
Okay, so if you are a creature like the cusk eel or the cavefish, and you have successfully navigated this biological economy by bulldozing your visual system to save calories, you still face a fundamental mechanical problem. You still have to navigate a complex three-dimensional space.
You do.
You still have to find food in an environment where meals are separated by vast distances. You still have to avoid the predators that haven't given up their eyes. So if you remove vision from the equation, what exactly replaces sight in the abyss?
This brings us to the sensory array of the unseen. Because nature fundamentally abhors a vacuum, especially a sensory one. If an organism liquidates the sense of sight, it immediately reallocates that freed up neural real estate to expand and refine other senses.
And the text describes these replacement senses as functioning so effectively that they feel like borrowed magic.
They really do.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's start with the one that genuinely challenged my understanding of physics.
Yep.
The lateral line system. The text describes this as a row of tiny, fluid-filled canals running down the lateral sides of a fish's body and extending over its head.
Yes, and these canals are packed with specialized clusters of cells called neuromasts.
Neuromasts.
Neuromasts are essentially mechanoreceptors. They possess tiny, hair-like structures encased in a gelatinous cupula.
Right, and they are so incredibly sensitive that they can detect the absolute faintest pressure waves moving through the water. We have to remember that water is roughly 800 times denser than air, which means it is an incredibly efficient medium for transmitting physical forces.
Much more efficient than air.
When something moves in water, it displaces fluid, creating a pressure wave that travels outward.
It provides what is essentially a tactile sense of hearing operating over a distance. The neuromasts detect these microscopic shifts in water pressure, and the hair cells translate that mechanical displacement directly into electrical action potentials that fire into the fish's brain.
The examples the source text gives of how this is applied are wild. An eyeless fish, using its lateral line, can detect the subtle shift in the ambient ocean current. It can detect the hydrodynamic wake left behind by a predator that swam past 30 seconds ago.
It's basically reading tracks.
Yeah, it can literally read the turbulence signature in the water to determine the size and speed of the animal that left it. Some species are so acutely tuned that they can detect the rhythmic, microscopic pulsing of another animal's heartbeat transmitted through the water column.
What is truly fascinating here from a neurological perspective is how the brain synthesizes this data. The lateral line allows an entirely blind fish to construct a highly accurate, constantly updating, three-dimensional spatial map of its immediate surroundings.
It's a map.
It isn't sight, but it fulfills the exact same ecological function. It is a topographic map drawn in pressure differentials instead of photons.
Hang on, I want to really sit with this and try to put myself in the perspective of these animals, because it is so profoundly alien to the human experience.
Yeah.
Imagine you are standing in a perfectly pitch black room. You are completely blindfolded. You can't see a thing. But someone standing on the exact opposite side of the room simply waves their hand in the air. And you can physically feel the resulting air pressure shift against the skin of your face so precisely, with such high resolution, that you know exactly where they are standing, how large their hand is, and the exact trajectory of their movement.
That is the exact functional reality of the lateral line. It is a full-body, high-resolution awareness of physical displacement in the environment.
And some species take this reliance on physical touch and displacement even further, evolving highly specialized structures like barbels.
Yes, those long, fleshy, whisker-like protrusions you often see on the chins of catfish, or deep-sea scavengers like grenadiers and rat tails.
The text describes these deep-sea scavengers slowly cruising just inches above the abyssal plain, dragging these long barbels across the silty seafloor. And the barbels are densely packed with highly sensitive taste buds.
They are tasting the mud.
They are literally dragging their tongues across the mud, like a blind person reading the topography of a room with their fingertips, tasting the sediment for the chemical signature of buried prey or decaying matter.
It is a hyper-specialized form of contact chemoreception. You are essentially tasting the physical landscape. And speaking of chemoreception, we absolutely cannot overlook the sheer overriding power of olfaction smell in the midnight zone.
Right. The source text explicitly mentions that smell can travel vastly further and much more reliably in the deep ocean than light ever could. Because in a fluid environment, a scent isn't just a fleeting odor in the breeze. It is a persistent physical plume of dissolved amino acids and chemicals drifting along the deep ocean currents.
Exactly. It creates a chemical gradient. And the source material highlights deep-sea scavengers like certain species of sleeper sharks and hagfish that have evolved olfactory bulbs that make up a massive percentage of their brain volume.
Huge noses, basically.
Basically, their nostrils are exquisitely tuned to detect a single molecule of decaying flesh dissolved in millions of gallons of water.
A single molecule of a dead whale or marine snow drifting down from the surface miles away.
They can lock onto that chemical plume and trace the concentration gradient backward for kilometers. They arrive at a carcass in total darkness, navigating purely by chemistry, long before any animal relying on vision could have ever spotted it.
That is incredibly efficient.
It is. In an environment where significant caloric windfalls, like a whale fall, are separated by vast stretches of barren desert, the ability to follow a microscopic chemical trail across miles of ocean is vastly superior and metabolically cheaper than trying to illuminate the darkness.
So we have three-dimensional pressure mapping, we have contact tasting of the mud, and we have long-range chemical tracking. But then the text leaps us back to the phenomenon of bioluminescence. And it frames it in a way I had honestly never considered before. It doesn't describe bioluminescence as a biological light show, it describes it as a language.
A deeply complex, silent language spoken by roughly 90% of the open water animals living below 200 meters. It is the dominant form of communication on Earth by sheer volume of participants.
They are producing their own light, either through internal chemical reactions involving luciferin and luciferase, or by hosting symbiotic colonies of glowing bacteria in specialized organs called photophores.
Yes.
And the text lists the vocabulary of this glowing language.
Yes.
Rapid flashes for territorial warnings, dangling, pulsing lures to mimic struggling prey and bait smaller fish, and that incredible active camouflage trick we mentioned earlier, counter-illumination, matching the downwelling blue light to erase your silhouette.
But here is the profound, lingering mystery that the source text raises, and it is a question that neurobiologists and marine scientists still struggle to fully answer. We perfectly understand how an eyed animal, like the giant squid, utilizes that bioluminescent information.
Right? It sees it.
It sees the flash, the photons hit the retina, the optic nerve transmits the signal, and the brain processes an image. But what about the animals that have completely bulldozed their visual systems?
Right. The text points out that for an entirely eyeless blind animal, a flash of bioluminescence in the water nearby might still register. It might still be perceived. But how? Without an eye, how do you see light?
The prevailing research suggests that many of these eyeless deep-sea creatures possess extraocular photoreceptors.
Okay, what does that mean?
They have specialized, light-sensitive cells scattered directly across their skin or concentrated along their neural pathways, entirely independent of a traditional eye structure.
Just on their skin.
Yes. They don't have lenses to focus the light. They don't have a retina to organize the spatial data, but their skin can detect the raw presence, intensity, and wavelength of the photons hitting them.
I really want to sit with this concept because the text practically begs the reader to imagine it. It asks what the physical world feels like to a complex organism that perceives light without ever forming a visual picture.
It's hard to even conceptualize.
It explicitly states that there is no human analog for this sensory experience, and obviously no way for us to ask a blind cusk eel what it is feeling.
We can only hypothesize based on neurology. Is the sensation of bioluminescence hitting their skin akin to how we feel radiant warmth when we step out of the shade and into direct sunlight?
Maybe.
Is it closer to a tactile vibration? Does a sudden flash of blue warning light from a predator trigger a diffuse, full-body physiological sensation like a sudden chill or a tingle down the spine?
Imagine being that eyeless fish. You are swimming through the freezing black void, navigating by the pressure waves of the lateral line. Suddenly, a predator a few feet away aggressively flashes a bright blue bioluminescent warning.
You don't see it.
You don't see the blue flash, you don't see the shape of the predator's jaws, you form no image. But your skin, your very neurology, suddenly registers an overwhelming sensation.
Right.
A chemical residue, a full-body siren that bypasses the optic nerve and just feels intuitively, terrifyingly like the color blue. It is a sensory experience that is completely alien to the architecture of the mammalian brain.
This raises an incredibly important question about the limitations and biases of our own perception. We, as humans, are so overwhelmingly visually dominant as a species that we struggle to even conceptualize a reality built entirely out of pressure waves, chemical gradients, and full-body photoreception.
We just assume vision is the best way?
We assume that high-resolution sight is the ultimate apex way to map and understand the universe. But this deep dive proves that in the largest habitat on Earth, our specific kind of sight is a clumsy, metabolically expensive, deeply outdated technology.
Which provides the most breathtaking transition into the final environment the test explores. Because just when we think we have fully grasped the rules of this biological economy, that eyes are too expensive and life replaces sight with pressure, smell, and skin-deep sensation, we hit the absolute rock bottom of the ocean floor and the rules break one final spectacular time.
We descend into the abyssal and hadal zones, depths pushing past 4,000 to 6,000 meters and beyond.
The text describes the physical conditions down here, and it sounds less like Earth and more like the surface of a rogue planet. Water pressure measured in tons per square inch. Utter suffocating stillness. Temperatures hovering just a few degrees above absolute freezing. It sounds completely irreversibly dead.
Until, of course, you reach the tectonic boundaries, the hydrothermal vents.
These massive cracks in the Earth's crust venting superheated, mineral-rich, toxic water from deep inside the planet. Underwater geysers spewing black smoke into the freezing abyss. And here, swarming around these boiling chimneys, the text says we find one of the strangest, most ironic exceptions in this entire evolutionary story.
The vent shrimp, specifically species like Rimicaris exoculata.
They live their entire lives permanently clustered around these boiling geysers. And as you would perfectly expect for a creature living literally miles beneath the reach of the sun and following the economic rules we just established, they possess no visible eyes whatsoever.
The stalks are there, but the eyes are gone.
But when scientists examined them closely, they found something glowing under the shell on their backs.
A highly specialized, massive patch of light-sensitive tissue, a novel photoreceptor organ located beneath the transparent carapace on the dorsal side of the shrimp.
A patch on their backs. It isn't an eye. It doesn't sit where an eye should be anatomically. It doesn't have a lens or cornea. It isn't shaped like an eye. But it is biologically tuned to pick up a form of energy that seemingly shouldn't exist in the total darkness of the abyss.
It is tuned to detect thermal radiation. It is picking up the incredibly faint near-infrared black-body radiation, the literal glow of heat itself, being emitted by the 350 degrees Celsius water blasting out of the hydrothermal vent.
The text notes that while these vents don't produce sunlight, extreme heat actually gives off a very dim visible light, or at least radiation on the very edge of the spectrum. And these completely eyeless shrimp have evolved an entirely new sensory organ built from scratch, specifically to see that heat.
What is so remarkable and deeply ironic about this is the evolutionary trajectory it implies. We have spent this entire deep dive establishing that in a world without a sun, the biological economy violently demands that you aggressively scrap your visual system to save calories.
And life did exactly that.
It
bulldozed the eyes.
It bulldozed the eyes. But then, right at the absolute bottom of the world, life encounters a completely different, highly localized source of radiation geothermal heat. and it decides to completely reinvent the concept of vision from the ground up just to utilize it.
Okay, let's look at the math on this because it feels like a contradiction. We just spent all this time talking about how metabolically expensive it is to maintain photoreceptor tissue.
Right.
If evolution is all about ruthlessly cutting costs, how does a vent shrimp justify the massive metabolic calorie bill required to build and maintain a completely new, bizarre, heat-sensing patch on its back? Does the economic math of survival just completely flip when you get near these vents?
That is precisely what happens. The math flips because the extreme nature of the environment flips. The abyssal plain is a desert of starvation, but a hydrothermal vent is an oasis of immense chemical energy.
So there's plenty of food.
The water is rich in hydrogen sulfide, which specialized chemototrophic bacteria use to synthesize food, which the shrimp then eat. But the vent is also an incredibly narrow, highly lethal tightrope.
Right. The water coming directly out of the chimney can be hundreds of degrees Celsius. It can literally boil a shrimp alive in a fraction of a second.
Exactly. So the metabolic cost of building and constantly repairing a thermal sensing patch on your back is instantly and unequivocally justified if it prevents you from drifting half an inch too close to the geyser and being instantly cooked. The organ pays for itself by keeping the organism in the exact millimeter-perfect Goldilocks zone, warm enough to farm bacteria, but far enough away to avoid death.
The text leaves the exact nature of this organ as a tantalizing, unanswered question, though. It asks, is this backpatch purely a proximity alarm, a warning system screaming at the brain to avoid drifting into the scalding water? Or is it a compass, a beacon, guiding them home to the only source of warmth and food in a freezing, trackless world with no other landmarks?
In all likelihood, it functions as both. But the reality is, while we have dissected the organ and mapped its ability to absorb thermal radiation, we have not fully solved the neurological puzzle of what it means for the shrimp to possess it.
Because you don't know what they're feeling.
How does the shrimp's rudimentary ganglion brain process that thermal signal? Is it experiencing a visual image of a glowing, towering heat source in the dark? Or is it experiencing an overwhelming, instinctual, non-visual pull, like a moth irresistibly drawn to a flame?
It is just wild. The text sums up this entire deep-sea saga beautifully. Life down here didn't lose vision because darkness demanded it in some passive, accidental sense. It rebuilt vision because the ocean's midnight zone runs on a brutal, unforgiving economy. Everything has to earn its keep. And seeing heat is the only way to earn your keep at the bottom of the world.
Which brings us to a much larger and frankly profoundly unsettling realization about our place on this planet.
Yes. The final chapter of the source text completely recontextualized everything I thought I knew about Earth.
It forces a massive perspective shift.
It starts with a statistic that we've all heard repeated in documentaries, but it hits so much harder after everything we just discussed. More than 80% of the ocean is completely unmapped, unobserved, and unexplored by humanity. To this day, we have mapped the dry, dead surface of Mars with vastly higher resolution than we have the bottom of our own ocean.
Every single time an expedition sends an ROV or a manned submersible down into the abyssal trenches, even today, there is a very high statistical probability of discovering a completely novel biological mechanism or a species that no human being has ever seen, cataloged, or named.
But the text makes a specific point that really chilled me. It says that these strange, eyeless, heat-seeing, pressure-sensing creatures we've been talking about for the last hour, they are not the rare edge cases of biology.
Yeah, they aren't.
They are the weird freaks of nature living on the extreme fringes of a normal world.
If you look at it mathematically, given that the aphotic zone is by a massive margin the largest continuous habitat on Earth, dwarfing all terrestrial ecosystems, all forests, all plains, all surface waters combined, these blind pressure-sensing creatures are likely the most common, statistically standard evolutionary outcomes on the planet.
We think of a lion running across the savannah, or an eagle flying, or a human being walking down the street as the default setting for complex life. But the actual default setting for life on Earth is a blind, gelatinous creature dragging sensory barbells through the mud, tasting for dead plankton in the freezing, crushing dark.
We are the edge cases.
We are. We are the weird, localized anomalies living up here on the thin, sun-baked crust of a water world.
This raises a deeply important question about human arrogance and the limitations of our philosophy. We define reality strictly by what we can see, hear, and touch. We build our entire scientific paradigm, our technology, and our understanding of the universe around our own highly specific mammalian sensory framework.
Right.
But the source material proves unequivocally that our framework is just one, not sight as we know it, not sound, not smell. They could be navigating via subtle shifts in electromagnetic fields or interacting with quantum biological phenomena that our physicists haven't even theorized yet.
Just mind-blowing.
Evolution didn't merely remove a sense from these deep-sea creatures. It replaced our entire human framework for what a sensory input can even be.
So what does this all mean?
Yep.
We spend billions of dollars looking up at the stars. We build these massive orbital telescopes. We send rovers to the Martian surface. We scan the deep galaxy looking for the faint signatures of alien life, hoping to find an organism that perceives the universe differently than we do.
Yes.
And all the while, the vast, overwhelming majority of our own planet is populated by creatures operating on an entirely different sensory plane, swimming miles beneath our feet. We don't need to look to the stars. We already live on an alien planet. We just happen to live on the roof.
It is a profoundly humbling realization. It demands that we recognize the sheer creative plasticity of life and the unforgiving economic forces that shape it. Nature is absolutely not bound by our narrow definitions of perception.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's just briefly trace the massive descent we've taken with this source material. We started at the sunlit surface, diving down to see how the very physics of water molecules act as a selective thief, stripping away the red wavelengths and leaving us in a bruised blue twilight zone.
Where we witnessed the desperate, hyper-competitive arms race for the last photon. The fluid-filled domes of the barrel-eye fish, the asymmetric game theory of the cockeyed squid, and the staggering cellular engineering of multibank retinas straining to survive in the half-light.
Until we crossed the threshold at 1,000 meters, entering the true midnight zone, where the biological math changed entirely, where we learned that the most metabolically expensive organ you can own becomes a deadly liability. We saw the blind cusk eel and watched the Mexican blind cavefish literally chemically bulldoze their own embryonic eyes, because the ultimate rule of the deep is that evolution preserves only what actively pays for itself.
We explored the borrowed magic of replacement senses, the intricate fluid dynamics of the lateral line, the vast chemical tracking gradients of barbells, and the deeply mysterious full-body language of bioluminescence.
And finally, we hit the abyssal seafloor, where vent shrimp completely reinvented the very concept of sight from scratch, just to see the lethal heat of boiling geysers in the freezing dark. You are now armed with this incredible new perspective on biology. You have seen evolution not just as some passive, slow march of progress, but as an unforgiving, yet deeply, brilliantly creative metabolic economy.
An economy that ruthlessly liquidates biological assets that fail to perform and invests heavily, almost miraculously, in whatever bizarre adaptation ensures survival for one more day in the dark.
And that profound idea of evolutionary cost leaves me with one final provocative thought. Something for you to mull over as you go about your day in this bright, sunlit terrestrial world. If the deep sea definitively proves that nature ruthlessly phases out biological luxuries that don't pay for themselves, what parts of human biology or human perception or even human consciousness itself might just be temporary metabolic luxuries?
That is a staggering implication.
Think about it. If humanity were suddenly subjected to an entirely different, incredibly harsh, resource-starved environment, say, trapped on a generational colony ship in deep space for tens of thousands of years, or sealed in a post-apocalyptic subterranean bunker for 1,000,000 years, what senses or cognitive abilities might our own bodies actively decide to bulldoze to keep us alive? What parts of what makes us fundamentally human would evolution look at, run the caloric math, and say, we simply can't afford the calorie bill for this anymore?
The human brain consumes 20% of our energy. The body keeps the ultimate ledger. It is entirely possible that in the right environment, high-level consciousness itself could be deemed an unaffordable liability.
It is something to seriously think about the next time you look at a vibrant sunset, and take the immense metabolic cost of rendering that image for granted. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. It's been an absolute trip into the dark, and we hope you walk away seeing the world and what it actually means to see a little differently.